I'm Randall Nichols. For those that don't know, I hold the Ursel Victor and Maxine Hoover Beane Chair of Quaker Studies. I also am an assistant professor of religion here at William Penn University. Today we have three people with us who are going to talk a little bit about their experiences in religious leadership, focusing on some of the challenges that they've faced being women in religious leadership. To my far right is Pam Brayman, then Della Stanley Green, and Sylvia Mills Graves Beane. We'll get everybody here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and give you a little sense of their work and their ministry. Della will be our moderator for this panel discussion. So please welcome these three.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here this morning. And we're going to cover a lot of territory in 45 minutes. And then I understand there's some other opportunities later on. So I am Della Stanley Green. I am the co-director of the Quaker Leadership Center, which is part of the Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana, which is basically just go east almost to the Ohio border, and there you are. So I get the joy of moderating this discussion, and we're going to start off with what organizational leadership roles have you had, and what fulfillment have you experienced in each of them? And I am timing things so we make sure that we get to all the questions, and I'm going to ask Sylvia to go first on this one.
I'm Sylvia Mills Graves Beane. I met Dale Graves here in 1965 when I was a new student, and this building was just being built. It needs repairs, and so do I. And really pleased to be here on this team. I've had a career of public education for 34 years where I became the school principal there. And I was also then, as soon as I finished that work, I was invited to come to Friends United meeting and serve as an administrator on a short-term basis that turned out to be 6 years. I then was working for Sharing Your World Resources, a Quaker ministry for creating micro loans to people in Kenya, Sierra Leone, and India, and now in Guatemala. I did that on 2 short stints, and then I worked as a team person with 3 women who held the role of superintendent of our yearly meeting in Quakerese. That's our church conference in a geographical district of about 40 churches. And we shared for 2 years the task of being the yearly meeting superintendent. I retired 5 times.
Sylvia is an example of how to fail retirement. So what would you say were some of the fulfilling things in these roles for you, especially having moved from leadership in public schools to then religious leadership?
Well, I'm going to be brief enough to say my most fulfilling role was being the General Secretary, the director of Friends United Meeting, which is our overarching mission organization among Quakers based in Richmond, Indiana. It was there where I felt surrounded by people trying to do the work of God. And that doesn't happen everywhere you go. Sometimes it doesn't even happen in your own church. But in Friends United Meeting, we were representing Iowa and New England and California and Cuba and Kenya and many, many different areas of the world, trying to come together for one organization for one purpose, and that is to bring the love and light of Jesus Christ in God's will together. Where else can you rub elbows with all those people that love that kind of work? I bet you know what that means, Pam.
So Pam, it's your turn to weigh in on this.
So my story is I grew up in a faith tradition that didn't have women pastors, and so it didn't really cross my mind that that was a possibility, even though I was highly involved in leadership in high school and college. It just didn't cross my mind. But a couple years out of college, felt like I should at least go to seminary, and that began a journey for me. Originally, my first ministry position, I was on the staff of a non-denominational church, and it was a church where I was in a ministerial role but not called pastor. And then when I left that, I really wanted to find a tribe where my ministry gifts would be recognized and I could be ordained. And I found the Free Methodists, and that's the denomination I'm with right now. That was a good place to find my tribe. In that tribe, I've been a pastor and a church planter, and now I'm a superintendent, and I oversee churches in Western and Central New York. And that's the place probably where I've had the most fulfillment, because I see a lot of past experience and education all coming together with the challenges of overseeing churches that are everywhere from small to large and a bunch of different expressions of the body of Christ. And so I think that's my most fulfilling. It's certainly my most challenging role, because every day is different, and there's wonderful pieces, and then you're dealing with crisis too, and so I've really enjoyed this role.
As I said, I co-direct the Quaker Leadership Center. That means I have a co-director that I work with, and his name is Andy Stanton Henry, and he actually works and lives in East Tennessee, and I live in Indiana. And so part of what we're learning to do, and we learned some of this in COVID, in the role that I was in at the time, but how to create community online, how to have a working relationship. Now we also meet in Richmond, Indiana 2 or 3 times a year. I find it's really fulfilling to have somebody else who thinks about the same things that I'm thinking about, to be leaders together. That's really a fantastic thing. And full disclosure, Sylvia and I were 2 of those 3 women who were in the role that she was describing for those couple of years. And again, for me, that was really a wonderful, fulfilling thing, was to have each of us there, Sylvia, our friend Sue, and me, and each of us getting to work from our strengths. We had worked together as volunteers within our yearly meeting for, I don't know, something close to 10 years. We'd worked on various things over time, but the 3 of us had worked on several projects together before we entered this unusual sharing of leadership. And what we discovered was, if we each did the things that we did best, it was a lot less work. And that was really very fulfilling. It felt like we were honoring the gifts that God had given to us, and that we also knew each other's weaknesses. So we would always be sharing with each other things that we'd written, maybe for our weekly newsletter that we were sharing. Particularly during COVID, it was really important to get things out to our people in our different local churches, for them to understand what was going on, to be praying for each other, to be encouraged. Our leaders were feeling fairly isolated, I would say, and so we made phone calls to them. We offered them opportunities to rest, to pray with them. And we discovered that really this being able to work from our strengths and our gifts was just a blessing for everybody. It felt like there was more energy, more capability. And honestly, in some ways, even though COVID was a difficult time, one week we were all 3 in the office, the next week we were all at home. Fortunately, I had been doing Zoom for a while, so I was able to help us get going with that. And everything shifted. And we had to learn. We really had to learn how to be supportive of the leaders that we were trying to be leaders for. And in some ways, as hard as that was, I loved that challenge. And what I really loved was being part of this small community. We were friends at the beginning of this, and people kept saying, "Are you still going to be friends by the end of this?" And guess what? We were, and we are. In fact, the 3 of us sat down and had lunch together last week in Indiana. So I would say that's been one of the most fulfilling things, and I feel very, very blessed to be able to continue that with yet another person. Other roles that we've had that have been particularly, that maybe there was a particularly fulfilling element to, because we've still got 6 minutes for this section. I'm excited. Either of you?
I mentioned public education. There's a lot of space for Christians and leaders in public education. And I was glad to be a second grade teacher, a third grade teacher, then the music teacher, then became the principal, all in the same building for 34 years. When I became a principal, I had been with a principal for 23 years who had managed with the idea that if you intimidate people enough, you can have a disciplined school. And I wanted to fix that. So it was a challenge to become trained to be a collaborative leader. Sometimes I felt good about the way that worked out, and sometimes I said, oh, we're moving too fast here. These people aren't ready to jump on board with that. But when you have 600 students a year that you influence for that many years, I feel like there's been an opportunity to lead and encourage teachers of thousands of students in my lifetime. So that felt really good.
I think one of the roles I'm enjoying right now that's a volunteer role is I'm a trustee at our college, which is Roberts Wesleyan, and that's actually where my office is. And we very intentionally put the office on the campus, and as not part of my job, but because I love it, I've been mentoring a lot of students, having a lot of faith conversations. You know, people come to Roberts and don't and know it's a Christian college, but don't even know what that means. And so discovering that people have no faith background at all, but want to have conversations. And so I mean, that's the kind of thing I love to do. So I engage as much as I can on the college campus.
One of the leadership roles that I had before Sylvia and I were doing work together in the interim superintendency and before my current position was I worked for 14 years as the executive director of an organization with a really long name, Indiana Network for Higher Education Ministries, which is a mouthful. Unfortunately, they had changed the name right before I started, and so we weren't able to change it to something much shorter and much more reasonable. But we worked with campus ministries and chaplains on both public university and private college campuses. And one of the most fulfilling things about that was getting to work with people across denominations and actually across religious traditions, because in order to be able to work in the public universities, we needed to also engage with folks of other religious traditions beyond Christian. And that was challenging in some ways, and yet it was really good to see that many of the questions that students asked, many of the things that people cared about, the questions that were the focus of anybody your age, what am I going to do with my life? What's important? How do I make meaning and purpose? What difference does it make that I'm on this earth? That everybody has those questions. And so I got to work primarily with the campus ministers and the faculty of the student religious organizations. And I really enjoyed that variety of exposure. And yes, there were some religious traditions that were not as welcoming of my presence as others, and that was okay. They didn't have to interact with me, it was purely choice. So, but it was really fulfilling to I got to visit probably at least 35 college and university campuses across Indiana over those years. And that was really interesting. So that was another thing. I got to work with a lovely board of people who were just from a variety of traditions. I think of two of my wonderful mentors, two very different people. I myself am a Quaker, part of Religious Society of Friends, and my family has been for a very long time, but I've always had the opportunity to interact with people of other religious traditions. And two of my mentors were George Jones, who was a Southern Baptist layperson who had been the religious coordinator at one of the state schools there in Indiana when that was still a possibility. And he had really formed a model of collaborative campus ministry where everybody did their own things, but they got together periodically and talked with each other about what's going on campus, and did things together to encourage them to not see each other as competition, but to see each other as part of this larger collaboration of addressing students' spiritual lives. So he was one of my mentors, and at this point he was retired. And my other mentor was Sister Norma Rockledge, a Franciscan sister who had held pretty much every position in Marian University, which was there in Indianapolis. She had graduated with a degree in classics, but she had been I think she'd been the advancement director. I think she'd worked on mission effectiveness. She'd been the acting president. She'd been the academic dean. And she was the most humble person. I mean, when you first met her, you would never think, oh, this is a pretty high-powered woman in leadership. But she absolutely was. And George, on the other hand, coming from a tradition that by the time he passed away, no longer embraced women in ministry, but had been around in the era when they did, was one of those people who very much encouraged. I was the first woman to lead that organization, and he was actually the head of that search committee. So, okay, we have finished off the time for this section. We're going to move into the probably less fun to talk about, but really important thing about we as women in religious leadership still face some barriers, and even in 2025, and certainly in the decades that each of us have been in ministry, there have probably been some difficulties or barriers. We have probably encountered people who like to remind us either directly or indirectly that they don't see women in ministry as appropriate. And there's certainly some things in our culture that tend to keep us from always being able to embrace 100% our roles, or that people don't want us to. So, Pam, I wondered if you might share, because I know you've had some interesting experiences.
Yeah, I had too many things on my list, but I narrowed it down to a couple, and I'll do one, and if there's time, I'll do the second. One of the challenges, and this is not just for me, but as I work with other women, is I'm going to call it the not being seen for who they are or who we are. I remember a mentor of mine telling me early on that he thought I had more administrative and teaching gifts. And anybody who knows me would say, you're a preacher and you're a leader. But he was really uncomfortable saying those things because of his own bias and his own theology. But he had a huge impact on my life. So for years, for example, I thought I was a teacher, not a preacher. And it wasn't until I was preaching every week that I had somebody who was a pastor in my congregation say, there's teachers and preachers. And I said, yeah. And he said, and you're a preacher. I said, I'm not what? And so it's that not being seen. I was working with a group of young pastors, and someone was there teaching them. And the teacher said, who first had the I see in you conversation? Meaning, who was the first person who looked at you and said, you're called to ministry? And the guys immediately knew. And the women sort of stumbled. And I pulled all the women aside afterwards, and I said, talk to me. And what they all said was, nobody really said it until I was doing it. I was already doing it. I already felt like I had a call to ministry. I had already stepped in. And that's when somebody said, oh, like maybe you have these gifts. So it's that not being seen for who you are. Again, I don't know if this would be a tradition that would talk about apostles and prophets and evangelists and shepherd and teachers, but in Ephesians it talks about those either 4 or 5 things, depending on how you understand that passage. I was in a place I don't know, 15 years ago when somebody said to me, "You're an apostle," and I said, "I'm a what?" And because my faith tradition would not have talked about that, and I said, "What's an apostle?" And she said, "You're a change agent. You take new territory." And I was like, "Yeah, that's me." And when I started looking up what apostolic leadership was, it made so much sense. It made sense even why I was butting heads in places where I was butting heads. But nobody had ever seen those things in me and called them out. So I think that's one of the challenges for me.
Sylvia, is there something you might like to share?
I grew up in a family with 4 brothers. My brothers and I played ball together. My brothers and I washed dishes together. My brothers and I had family events and family things that we always did, mixed in group where it didn't matter what gender we were. So I felt nourished and affirmed all the way through my childhood. That's got to be a big change for some of the other people that I know. When I got to be a teacher and was gearing up toward that principal position, I was the first female administrator in our school district. That didn't bother me, but I think it bothered them. The first principals meeting we had, I walked in the room and all of a sudden it got real quiet and the snickering stopped and I went, "Oh, I'm spoiling your fun, aren't I?" But I never really felt through developing a kinship with those other guys on the team. And once in a while they'd say, "Hey, you guys," or we got, and then they'd look at me and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, Sylvia, I said, "It's okay, just say you guys and I know what you mean." So I think that I didn't ever have the feminism streak in me that wanted to stand up for what I believed was unfair, because I felt like I was treated fairly all the way through. And it was a privilege for me to be that first woman principal. They hired another one the very next year, like maybe that wasn't such a bad idea after all. And I've been very encouraged by all the people that have surrounded me.
I think for me, one of my first realizations, having grown up as a Quaker, in which our tradition from the very, very beginning recognized the equality of women and that God could use women to speak and to preach and teach and administrate and do all the kinds of things that men were called to do as well. But as I was growing up in a family where it was very egalitarian, yes, my parents had fairly traditional gender roles as far as my mother was a stay-at-home mom when we were at home. She said she took her 22-and-a-half-year maternity leave. She was a professional librarian before we were born and eventually went back to it after we were gone. My father was a Quaker pastoral minister. So those gender roles were pretty typical for American life in the 1960s and 1970s. However, there was very much an egalitarian marriage. It was not one over the other. It was very much a partnership. And I never had the sense that there was something that I was not allowed to do for a vocation or for work. I was 16 years old. I was in probably American history class, must have been American history. And I remember there was something that happened in that class that day where it was like a little light bulb went on, and I realized that most of the other girls in the class were not growing up the way I was, where they knew that they could be a mom, they could be a nurse, they could be a teacher. And I had everything unfolded in front of me that was a possibility for me. And I was stunned. I was actually quite stunned to realize, oh yes, I'm extraordinarily privileged. I might not have used that word at that time in my life, but I've been given a huge gift. And I think that was part of what encouraged me that I might become a leader. I didn't think of it as leadership at the time because I thought of leaders as the people who were up front, who had the microphone. Those were the leaders. And then several things happened that made me realize over the next 6 to 8 years that there are very different ways of being in leadership. And eventually, yes, I did come into a position where I got to sit up front and have the microphone, but there are lots of other ways to be a leader, and that some of those are maybe not as up front. Now, then I had to struggle with, am I not up front because I'm a woman or because those are different gifts that I have? I'm still not always sure about that. Sometimes I think it's because I am by nature an introvert. By nature, I love the second position of leadership. I don't love being the person in charge. I love being there to help the person who is in charge do a really fantastic job and have my own projects. I like to do my own stuff. I just love when somebody else, the buck stops on their desk. But I would say that there has been a tendency in my mind particularly when there have been multiple times I've been the only woman in a committee meeting or something, that I have learned to speak up and speak loudly. Maybe not just because I'm the only woman in the room, but because I actually brought a different perspective. Maybe it was because I was the youngest person in the room. It might have been because I was a woman. It might have just simply been because I had different experiences. I think of this particularly as I've met in groups of people who were working with finances, which tend to be dominated by men. And discovered that sometimes asking questions that may sound ignorant, but that are just basic questions can be really helpful, because sometimes people forget that not everybody knows everything that they know, and that it's important to raise up those questions. In fact, one of my favorite stories of an experience with that was actually, and this is probably too long, I'm going to check my time here. Nope, still got time. I was invited to be part of a delegation that met on the island of Cyprus of Quakers who were working all across the Middle East at that time. And I was one of 2 people who were in their 20s. Everybody else was 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, with lots and lots of experience. I had interest in the area. I had spent a little bit of time in the area, but not months and years like many of these people had. And it was this conference was being led by somebody who had deep experience and was well respected by all of the people who gathered there. And in a couple of the sessions, I asked some pretty foundational basic questions because I wanted to understand. I wanted to really get what was going on. And this was really more about being a beginner than a woman, but I think sometimes women come from a beginner point of view if we've not been included in conversations in the past, which is why I'm including this. And I was a little bit embarrassed by this, and the leader, this respected leader, came to me at the break and said, "Thank you for asking those questions. They're really important because we can easily assume that everybody understands and everybody's working with the same definition of things." That was a really empowering moment for me as a leader to realize that sometimes leadership is about reminding people that not everybody is an expert on things and that we're all beginners on something at some point, at some time, and there's no shame in that.
We have time for one more
Yes,
story?
we do.
Okay, I'm going to tell this one. This isn't just in the faith community, but I think it's helpful for understanding some of the challenges that women face. I was part of a group that was going to be processing nominations for the role of bishop. Bishop in our system is the top leadership role. And this was about 6 years ago. At that point, we had never elected a woman. We have now, but at that point we had not. And I had been to a women clergy conference and sat in a workshop of a business professor who had been studying why women don't reach the C-suite, why women don't reach the top positions in businesses. And there were a couple things that she said that I wanted to bring back to this committee that was looking at nominees for bishop. And one was she said that in her research she discovered that women, when they're interviewing, will say we, because women tend to be more collaborative leaders. And but when you're interviewing for the top position, people don't want to hear we. They don't want to hear what a group of people did. They want to hear what you did. And so even changing language from we to I was important. So I wanted to report that out. And then the other thing she said, which has been researched pretty significantly, is that often women's voices are not heard in places. And so women can have great ideas, and what often happens is the woman has a great idea, it's not really heard, or it's heard subconsciously. A man hears it, picks up the idea, presents it as his own, and then it's the man who has the great idea. And a lot of times women will just say, well, the idea was taken, yay, no problem. I mean, I've done that a lot, right? So I thought that was important to bring back to this committee. So I asked if I could, and at this committee it was a conference call, and so I presented these two things as really important for this board to consider. The very next person that was up was a man who had put together the calendar for when we were going to get nominations and all of this. And he was talking through the whole calendar, and I interrupted him and said, wait, you've forgotten that there's no time for us to get input from the candidates. I'm assuming we want to hear what their vision is for the denomination and what they have for us. And he said, oh, no, we've got plenty of time, and he moved on. And I kept thinking, well, I'm going to get back to it sooner or later because there really isn't the time. Well, he talked long enough that he talked all the way around, and finally he said, oh, wait. He said, in corporate America, when you're hiring a top position, they need to have a white paper that they present with their positions, and I haven't put time in this for somebody to do a white paper. And I'm sitting there thinking, didn't I just say that? Didn't I just say that? And so certainly, I had just presented it, so certainly I thought he would finish, and somebody would say, oh, this is what Pam was just talking about, right? And he finished, and what happened was, people said, oh, great catch, good idea. And we went on. And I thought, okay, certainly after the meeting, I was so stunned I didn't say anything. After the meeting, somebody's going to reach out to me and say, wow, I just saw that. Nothing. And so that was one of those times. And again, a lot of times I would just say, well, it got done, no problem. But I had just presented it. And so that's sort of the subtleties of some of the things that we face.
That's really good but kind of sad story to end on for that section. And we are doing so well. It's fine. I'm very happy. And I'm sorry, I've got to get back to our questions here. And my iPad has said, get time down. So the last question is really around what do we need from others to help us develop and serve effectively? And who have those mentors been, and what did they do to help support us as women in ministry? So Sylvia, would you be ready to take that on, or do you want me to punt it over to Pam first?
I was working on this idea of mentors before we came, and really can't point out one or two more important people than others. I have had people in my home church, my home meeting, who have encouraged me and taught me by their examples. I have been in a what we call spiritual friends group, where there were 3 other women that I have always looked to for wisdom and courage and a calm presence, being those grounded people that make things happen, but they don't fling out their femininity to do it. Those are the important people to me. The person that was assigned to me as a mentor in my recording process. Now, recording process among friends means that your gifts of ministry have been recognized by generally your home meeting, your home church, and they're the ones who come to you and say, we've noted your gifts of ministry. And we'd like to recommend that you be a recorded minister among friends, and we'd like to ask you if you'd like to go through that process. But it didn't come from the person themselves. You need to be recognized by a group before you step forward and said, I want to be a pastor. So the person who will, in that process, was assigned to me as my mentor turned out to be one who taught me lots of ways to not be, lots of things to not do, lots of behaviors that were not helpful and nourishing to your fellow journey people. So maybe a negative form, I had a mentor that taught me all the ways to avoid being, because it just wasn't effective relationship building. Can that be possible? You look at people and you say, I don't think God wants me to be like that. So what does God call us to be? That's the important thing. And I learned that more from observing. Let your lives speak. Those lives that I watched are the ones who taught me the best.
I think for me too, I haven't particularly, I don't have a lot of long-term mentors. I have a long-term spiritual director who has been very, and then I think that, as I say that, there's been a team of people I have brought alongside who know me well enough to call me on my stuff, right? And tell me when I'm being silly, or to point out both the good and the bad. Sometimes when I'm discouraged, point out the good when I forget there's good there. And so there's been peers that I meet with even now weekly from our doctoral program, and sort of a support group around. But as far as mentors go, it's been more of the Lord has brought different people to me in different seasons. When I needed encouragement in something, I needed to learn something, I needed a door opened. In our system, a number of years ago, a woman did a doctoral research on where women were getting into different places, and she said she found it was really important for them to have what she called a benevolent male advocate, and that meant somebody, a man, who was advocating for that woman. I think as we get more women into leadership places, if you can now have a woman who is in a leadership place who can advocate for you as well. But having those advocates along the way was important. But for me, just sustaining life-giving rhythms, finding people who are secure enough in themselves that they want you to succeed has been really important.
I want to pick up on that last thing that you said, because I think that, whether it's a man or a woman, someone older than you, younger than you, who's in your same age bracket, that really is the key. And that very much resonates with what Sylvia had said too. It's people who are as invested in God working through you as they are God working through them, and really wanting the power of the Holy Spirit unleashed in the world, and being willing to invest, whether it's in a conversation over coffee, or whether it's in a weekly meeting on Zoom, or a monthly meeting of spiritual friends. I too experienced having a benevolent male presence, and actually a couple. One was my boss for a couple of years, and he helped me realize the importance of not always staying in the background, that sometimes it was important to be up front. He helped me learn the importance of paying attention to details, which was not my natural strength. He helped me understand that, just like any work, even ministry has those things that are less than fun to do, and you take care of them. And yes, sometimes you have to take care of them yourself. Sometimes you can lift up your eyes and look around and discover that somebody else has those gifts and call them forth to help you with things. And that was really good too. So those three things in particular, I feel like he helped me see. There was another mentor, or though he would probably not have had any idea that he was a mentor at all. I was in a group when I was in my early 30s probably, that worked on Sunday school curriculum that was done across denominations. It was a joint effort, and I got to be part of this team that worked on pulling the ideas together and getting things moving forward. We got to do kind of the grand structure of things. And in this was a gentleman who was the head of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which I had never even heard of. It's mostly in the South. And just the way that he was so encouraging and affirming and lifting up of women in ministry. Every time that group met, we met maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and he would always find some way to lift up the story of a woman in ministry or something that was going on in his denomination that was encouraging women in ministry. And I realized that his persistence in making that a regular practice, it was not just a one-off kind of thing. It was the way he engaged in ministries. This is normative, it's normal, and this is what's going on in the world right now, and I need to be a person who leads in that. And again, I would say the people that I get to work with, that there's that sense of mutual support is incredibly important. We have 2.5 minutes. Maybe each of us could have a final thought. Sylvia?
One of the questions that we didn't address is, what do women need to develop their leadership or to be affirmed as leaders? We need men who believe that we can do it, but we also need other women who believe we can do it. I just come from a Mennonite community in Belize, and I asked one of the women there, do you ever wish you could just sort of step out of this box that you're in, because there's so many restrictions on how they can interact with men? And the answer was, God calls me to be a servant to my husband and a mother to my children, and that's all I need to think about. Well, I felt a little insulted. I thought that I was serving my husband and doing a great job of raising my children and attentive to them, but I was also free to step beyond that and maybe use my gifts in some other ways. You have to be nurtured by everyone and encouraged by everyone to be the best you are and can be, and that God calls you to be. You can be an encourager to your men, and women can be encouraged by men, and men can encourage women, and we need to do that as well.
Yeah, I want to jump on the, women encouraging women. I have been, I love and I seek out, as a woman, groups of other women that we can support each other, challenge each other, laugh together, cry together, encourage one another. I've also been surprised at how often I've stepped into a space with other women and somehow I'm a threat, and somehow there's this idea that there was one position and I got it, and there's jealousy. And so find the places that are life-giving and just don't worry about the other places, because I think that's what you need to keep going.
I would just say that the main thing is pay attention to the gifts that other people have and help lift those up, and ask other people to identify what they see as your gifts. That's what I think it's all about in the end. So thank you all.